In this episode, we will learn about the history of the Oromo people. Here's Oromo historian Dr. Ezekiel Gabisa.
The Oromo belonged to the Cushitic-speaking people in the Horn of Africa. The Cushitic-speaking people are ancient people. Even ancient Egypt was, Cushitic. And Nubia was Cushitic. But in time, others came from other places and superimposed on them. So the origin of the Oromo people is that they were the ancient people in the area. One of the earliest people who spoke the Cushitic language. What happens is that in time, as people moved to other places, the language started to develop in different ways. So there was the highland Cushitic and the lowland Cushitic that were separated some 3,000 years ago. And then within this, there was the Eastern Cushitic and the Southern Cushitic. They started separating, not as known languages today, but as a language group today. The latest one within the Oromo occurred when the Konzo people today in southern Ethiopia and the Oromo people in much of the central Ethiopia started to separate, speaking different languages, sometime around 1000 BC, before Christ, that is, some 2,000 years ago. By 500 BC, they have really kind of separated. But this is my own interpretation, by the time of the Christian era, around 2,000 years ago, Konzo and Oromo separated and become distinct ethnic groups. Like today, 80% of the vocabulary of the Konzo and the Oromo are the same. So these are the recent separation. The Somali are too. They're Cushitic. It's that they separated. The Oromo, sometimes about 1,000 years ago, they had developed 3 distinct identifiers. One is they were governed by what is known as the Gada system. Second, they became believers in a belief system called Waq Efata. Third, they began to speak a distinct language called the Oromo language. There are the Konzo people in southern Ethiopia. There are the Sidama in southern Ethiopia. There are the Gedeo. There are the Kambata. Their languages seem to share a lot of vocabularies. They have this Gada system, an age-grade governance system. They have a sky god. What that tells you is that at some point in time, in the distant past, all of these people, the Somali, the Oromo, the Konzo, the Gedeo, the Sidama in particular, and the Kambata were the same people who shared all these 3. The belief in the sky god, a Cushitic language, and an age-grade system, governance system. But in time, as they moved to different places, they started to develop separate institutions and identities. The closest to the Oromo are the Konzo. The Sidama have similar institutions with the Oromo, like the age-grade governance system. The Gedeo have the same institutions. So they share these 3 things as generic institutions, but different practices which emerged over time as a result of external cultural interaction and internal dynamics like population growth. But these were basically the same Cushitic people who have the same roots. Sometime around 12th, 13th century, the population exploded and they started to move into some areas. From the eastern part of the present-day Rift Valley, some Oromo pastoralists, they expanded to the east, to the west, to the north, up to what is today Ethiopia. And then from there, from the central part, some went up to Tigray, the Raya and Azebu Oromo. These are moieties. They called the Raya and Azebu in present-day Tigray. Some went to the northwest, to what is today Gojam and Gondar, if in those areas. Underneath today's Amhara-speaking people, you find Oromo. If people from that region count their lineage, after 3-4 generations, they become Oromo. Others went to the east, like during the 16th century, to what is today Eastern Ethiopia, Harar. where they became the Itu and Hambana. Others went west, further west to the Sudanese side. There they settled. They became agriculturalists. They became participants in long-distance trade. And their economy changed, and their system of government also changed. Once their economic base changed, that they started to form states. They started to own property. So they have been there, but they have changed in time. Their institutions have changed in time, and they have expanded to different parts of Ethiopia in time. But that's a natural order of things. As population explodes, population grows, as they interact with other existing people. But there was really a migration of pastoralist Oromo. That doesn't mean that there weren't Oromo on the highlands of western central Ethiopia. There were Oromo-speaking people. But it was the pastoralists who, as a result of population explosion, came up to their ancestral lands and settled in large numbers. If you look at the population map of Ethiopia, it is this movement that actually made the Oromo-speaking area the largest in Ethiopia. Some Oromos who had the longest contact with Amhara in the central part of the country have accepted Orthodox Christianity. In other places, after the conquest in the 19th century, many Oromos, in fact, the significant portion of the Oromo, accepted Islam as their religion. Not because Islam was a particularly appealing religion to them, but that was available to them instead of the Orthodox Christianity, which they associated with the religion of their tormentors, their conquerors. So accepting Islam at the time in the 19th century was rejecting Orthodox Christianity. So you don't find many Orthodox Oromo in the east, in the southeast, in the central part, in RC region, all the way to Jimma, and some different pockets in all of Oromia. The other important element among the Oromo as far as Christianity is concerned is once it was introduced in the early 20th century, 1900 or late 1890s, Protestant Christianity quickly spread among the Oromo, in particular in the western part, in the Wallaga region. And people who served as evangelists for this actually came from Eritrea, because these are Oromo slaves who were sold many times, and they met Swedish missionaries in Eritrea. And from Eritrea, they went to the western part of Ethiopia, and there Protestant Christianity became the dominant religion in the West. So yes, there are Orthodox in certain parts of Ethiopia, in pockets of Orthodox Christianity, which expanded under the imperial government by force, by the way. But majority are Muslim, and a significant number of Protestants. But there are Orthodox Christians among the Oromo as well.
Oromos are said to have faced discrimination throughout ancient and modern-day Ethiopia. Here's Dr. Gabissa.
Under the imperial government of Ethiopia, the Oromos were conquered, and they were forcibly incorporated into the empire. Under the imperial regime, the policy of how to rule Oromo was to assimilate them. It's only a contention for power within Ethiopia that you get between the Tigrayans and the Amharas. Yes, the Amharas ostracized them. They drove them from power, but not completely. They always made sure that the Tigrayan ruling class, at least, were part of government. They always had this access. The Oromo are different. They were culturally despised. Not only Oromo, but the Somali, the Kambata, the Rasa, all these southern people who did not have any cultural and linguistic and religious affinity. The Amhara and Tigrayans, they speak related languages. They are from the same area. They are mostly Orthodox Christians. Oromos are either Muslim or traditional religious worshippers of the Waqifana, their Oromo religion. So they were made subject. They were subjects, had no access whatsoever to power unless they are assimilated.
Oromo land was targeted mainly because it was fertile, says Dr. Paulos Milkias. He's an ethnic Oromo who has written books on Ethiopian history. He says Oromos were the most oppressed under the feudal system because they had no control over their land and were only allowed to keep a small portion of what they produced. But he says there's more to the story when it comes to Oromo history.
They exaggerate this. They say that the Oromos were treated like second-class citizens. Well, they do not tell you that many of the aristocracy of the Oromos were intermarried with the ruling classes of Ethiopia, especially from Wallaka. Haile Selassie, for example, his great-grandfather was Oromo, his great-grandmother is also Gurage, and of course Amhara. Emperor Yohannes himself, Yohannes IV of Tigray, his mother was an Oromo. The ruling classes were intermarried and they controlled together. But the language they used was Amharic. Even Emperor Yohannes, even though he was ruling from Mekelle as Emperor of Ethiopia, in his correspondences, whether within the country or with foreigners, was in Amharic. Because Amharic has been spoken since the 12th century. But the ordinary people, the peasants and so on, whether they are Amharas or Oromos or Tigris, have always been looked down upon because they were poor. Poverty is class. It's a class situation.
He says poverty and land grabbing were the main issues, but some groups were subjected to much worse.
In the south, for example, there are some minority groups, small minority groups. Some of them were occupied by force by Emperor Menelik, 19th century. For example, Janjero, Kafa, Walaita. I mean, they fought. I mean, the Walaitas. Now, Haile Mariam Desalegn, who is the prime minister today, is a Walaita person. But their king at that time, Tona, actually fought against Emperor Menelik for 7 years. Large numbers of them were killed. And when you actually do that kind of thing, what happens is that once you defeat them, once you succeed to take over power, you actually take slaves. That's what created the problem. Not the ruling classes of Walaita, but the Walaitas also had minorities within their own state, because it was a state by itself. And those people were actually taken as slaves, you see, by the Amharas, the Tigris, and the Guragis, and the Oromos that worked with them, because Menelik did not fight only with the Amhara soldiers. His commander-in-chief was an Oromo general, Ras Goban Adachi. He was an Oromo. When they went and fought against the king of Walaita. So they took slaves. So once you do that, automatically you actually create a group of people that say, these are slaves, whatever. So that was actually created, unfortunately. And so because of the fact that many of the people that they actually captured and brought as slaves to the highlands happened to be darker, that stigma actually held on. Now, this is eroding. It's a good thing because the EPRDF, the present government, is trying to get rid of that as much as possible. They have appointed some of these people to higher positions that you wouldn't see during the time of the Derg or prior to the Derg.
And there's something else worth mentioning, he says.
Habesha actually refers to highland Ethiopians. It actually includes Tigris, Amharas, Oromos. And then you see by extension also, of course, it would include the Somalis, it would include the Walaitas, Kafas, and so on and so forth. Abyssinia actually comes from Habesha. So the Oromos, for some reason, the Oromo nationalists, that is, associate Abyssinia with Amharas and Tigris. But it is not right. Like, for example, when James Bruce came to Ethiopia in 1775, around that period.
James Bruce was a Scottish explorer who traced the origin of the Blue Nile to Lake Tana in Ethiopia.
A journey to Abyssinia, that's what he says. But where was he? He was in Gondar, and he had to pass through Wallo. Wallo is Oromo. And a large part of the areas at that time. So Wallo, Tigray, the Amhara area, and all the Oromo areas, like, in the Shah, for example, all of those areas at that time were called Abyssinia. If you read his book, he actually said when he arrived in Gondar, Gondar is like the center of Amhara area. And yet the people who were ruling the country were Oromos. This is the Galas in control of the country. So it is wrong for them to say that. What are they going to say about the Oromos that were part of the invading army of Emperor Menelik? Ras Gobernadachi was an Oromo. He was the commander-in-chief of Menelik's army. He was the one who actually went and invaded Walaita, who invaded Kaffa, who actually took over all that area in the south. If he's an Oromo, then he's not an Abasha, he's Abasha.
But Dr. Milkias admits that many Oromos would disagree with his views on these issues.
I think I'm different from many others in that I approach things objectively as possible. I'm an Oromo. I've never supported the Oromo nationalist idea that suggests separation, independence of Oromia. No, I said never. I don't support that. It's not good for Oromos. It's not good for the rest of the Ethiopians. We are the same people. Yes, I know that there are lots of coffee and gold and so on that comes from Oromia, but so what? The others are also Ethiopians.
Their contribution to the country's history, their contribution in the Battle of Adwa, right? Or the contribution in pretty much everything great about Ethiopia is huge.
That's Dr. Johannes Gedamu.
So what the narrow nationalists do is basically taking these huge credits that the Oromos deserve away from them. These narrow nationalists would be like maybe a minority in ideas, right? Happen to be very vocal. And they can take everybody alongside with them. And that creates a huge problem. And Lama Magarsa happened to be that guy who talks about Ethiopian unity, who talks about the notion that the Oromos were deprived of the credit that they deserve about talking about their history. There are so many Oromo generals who defeated the Italians, right, who kept Ethiopia independent and so on. But the Oromos don't even have a stage for them. And the guys that they have always been ruled, they have been made to not even appreciate the most precious piece of history they have as Oromos, which is really phenomenal.